the show is yours, my friend.
Excellent. Thanks, Rob. Yes, everybody, welcome to another edition of DeepRoots webinar series, where we take a deep dive into the best practices in brand expansion. Yes, honored to have today Joe Hodas, Chief Marketing Officer of Wana Brands, join us. And Joe, welcome, Joe. How you doing?
I'm good, thanks, Eric. I appreciate it. How you doing?
Yeah, very good, very good. So yes, Joe, it's wonderful to have you because I don't think there's a company in the world that has more experience moving into new markets than Wana Brands. Your partner, co-founder, CEO, Nancy, was really one of the very first people that started to expand into new markets. I think as early as 2017 or 16. You'll fill us in. But you know, now you have the largest brand footprint of any cannabis company in the U.S. that is solely dedicated to brands. So we welcome you to the show. There's going to be a lot to learn for our attendees. And yeah, please give us a little bit of a rundown, Joe. Give us a little bit of a background, where you are, what you've been doing, and you know, we'll dive in.
Sounds good, Eric. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And hello to everyone. So real quickly to correct the data point, so we actually started expansion really in 2015 and began expanding into new markets. And we are now at about 15 states plus Puerto Rico and 9 provinces in Canada. Mississippi actually was our most recent addition to that. So and we have several more to go probably before the end of the year and coming into the beginning of next year. So lots of expansion in the future. I personally have been with Wana for about 3.5 years, but have known Nancy since I started in the industry in January of 2014. So she and I go way back, and I've seen the growth both from the outside and from the inside. And what I can tell you, and I know a lot of what we're going to talk about today, is what are those best practices? How do we expand at a rapid pace, and how do we do it efficiently and effectively so that we can be successful in all those markets as we continue to build a national brand?
So maybe you weren't there day one, but you're certainly intimately familiar with the progression of how things have changed. Take us through, what did it look like years ago, and what does it look like today in terms of your approach?
Well, you know, it's interesting, Eric. There are some things that have evolved, and we become more efficient. So whether that's, you know, modeling, whether that's the production of the products in other markets, our training processes. In fact, I'll tell you that COVID and our inability to travel during that period actually really strengthened our ability to do training, because we had to do it remotely, right? We had to make sure that we were super dialed in with how to train our partners while remaining, you know, here in Colorado, or in some cases in our homes, right? So it was an interesting challenge that I think really benefited us from the standpoint of being able to develop a better process and procedure for those trainings. But there are some things that haven't changed. How do we evaluate partners? Who do we consider to be a good partner? What are the characteristics of those good partnerships, so that we can find the best and then learn how to replicate that in markets over and over and over? So that part really is rudimentary, and a lot of that has to do with the individuals, the company itself. You know, what is the culture? Who are they fundamentally that can help us grow our brand while we, of course, help them grow theirs?
We're going to dive into that because that's really important, that partner selection process. Before we get there, though, kind of talk to me about your core values of expansion. Like, what are the drivers behind your philosophy and the thesis, your investment thesis for entering these new markets?
Well, there's the first part of the thesis, which really isn't a thesis, it's a mission, right? So we believe in enhancing the lives of both the communities that we enter, as well as the people that live in those communities. And it's important to us to make sure that we have the ability to bring those products to market in a way that meets the quality and the expectation that we have for our products. So it really is a fulfillment on our mission to continue to build this out and to bring it to new markets, because with every new market, that means an opportunity to enhance people's lives, right? So that's part one of that. But in terms of the financial modeling, honestly, there's as many different ways to structure a relationship as there are markets, in the sense that you can go anywhere from just a straight up co-manufacturing partnership to who owns sales, who owns marketing, how does distribution work in each of those markets. So all of those factor into our modeling. But, you know, first and foremost, when we talk about financial modeling, we have to make sure that there's the potential for profitability. And that's important And it's not to say that we are money first. In fact, we're primarily impact first, but we also don't believe in going into markets unless we can be successful. And a lot of that has to do with the economics of those markets on an individual basis.
Has that changed a little bit? Obviously, way back it was growth and revenue, and obviously COVID comes along and people batten down the hatches a little bit. Now we're in a capital crunch in the capital markets, and has that impacted? You're like, okay, we can't be cash flow negative in a new market for 18 months anymore, where maybe in the past we were, or has that financial rigor changed at all based on capital?
So the financial rigor has changed, but I wouldn't say it's due to access to capital. I mean, we've always been self-funded and bootstrapped, so we've never taken on any sort of partners or debt. So we've always funded from operations, right? So it's always been built into our financial modeling. However, the market's changed, right? And we've learned quite I think, effectively how markets evolve over time. So we know when pricing is here, when we enter a market, we know that within 6 months it's going to be here because of price compression, competition, et cetera. So we know how to look at the markets a little bit differently and to structure that long term. And we've been able to, in some cases, bring that education to our partners so that when we're looking at the modeling, there are more creative ways to say, okay, this is our model for now, and we know that this is going to change over this period of time. So let's revise and change the model to better reflect the market. So building in more flexibility, which, side note, is something that I talk about quite often in cannabis. Anything you do, if you don't build in flexibility, you're going to find yourself in trouble. There has to be flexibility, whether it's modeling, production, packaging, whatever. Build in flexibility, right? So we've learned over time what these markets look like from nascent to fully mature, and been able to see that cycle happen a few times. And there's variations by market, but overall, we're able to look at a market a few years in the future and say, okay, is this a market where we can have a real opportunity? And we've made hard decisions to pull out of markets. California is a great example of that, where we did not see that pathway to profitability. We did not see a future where it made sense for us to stay in that market. So we made the tough decision to pull out. And those are, it's not just like, oh, today we're not going to be in California. I mean, these are big and impactful decisions that it takes a little bit of time and effort to make.
Is there a time frame that you'd like to see that market? Because you're working on a royalty basis, and even a high royalty is going to be a challenge to cover the costs associated with opening a new market with headcount and just the upfront investment and all that. But is there an ideal time frame that, like, okay, can we turn this thing in 12 months and get it to be generating cash? Or is it just, again, the flexibility of, like, as long as we see the progression, that's going to be fine. We just need to see the growth. How do you balance that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I will say that it's a little bit art and science, right? So it's not a specific, like, if it's not in 12 months, we're out, right? Because markets will vary. New York right now is, as has been publicly stated many times, kind of a bit of a mess, right? So, but we know that there's a real potential there long term. So that's a market that we might look at a little differently than, let's say, if we were to consider California again right now. California, just a different market, it's a different set of dynamics. Not seeing the path to profitability, the path to potential there today. It's not to say it doesn't occur in a year from now, because we constantly are evaluating. We know California is a critical market. It's largest cannabis market in the world, right? So it's not a specific number as much as it is, what is the potential long term? What impact can we have in the community? What does the overall marketplace look like in terms of, are the regulations such that it's not possible and those regulations aren't going to change, or is it just the economic conditions of that market and the competitors in that market? So those are some of the things that factor into that decision making.
Is there hard data that you rely on, even for the markets that you've already entered into, hard data that you've relied on to drive your decision making process as to whether you would go or not? There's a couple data providers in the industry here that kind of talk about market share and whatnot. Is there anything, because there's regulatory, that's a start. But in terms of, like, analytics, what are the drivers of the data that you've got to look at to make sure you're aligned?
Sure. So, I mentioned price compression earlier. So looking at what is the average price in the market over trailing 12 months? What does that look like, a little bit of predictive analytics, which right now we don't really have like a provider for that, as much as we just have to look at what, who's in the market, what's already happened in that market to determine what does price compression look like over the next 12 months. We look at that average price and we say, okay, we know the average price, we know the inputs for raw materials and cost of our packaging. Some of those things are hardwired, like our packaging costs. Some of those things will vary, like the cost of distillate in a given market. And we kind of bake that all into our financial modeling to say, okay, we need with our COGS here, we need X for wholesale revenue, which would be, Y on the shelf. And by the way, back to regulation, sometimes taxation figures into that, right? Because if we get to Y on the shelf, but it's also another, 50% above that, do we think the consumer is going to walk out with a product that costs, more than it does in other markets, also more than, let's say, flour or other formats? So all of that, those are all, really hard analytics that we look at, and we use those platforms to understand, again, average pricing, also product mix. Are edibles 10% of the market, or are they 20% of the market? Are gummies, 80% of that 10%, or are they, 70% of that 10%? So all of that goes into that modeling before we say, okay, financially viable. Now let's look at both the reality of our partner. What are they capable of producing? Because that's also part of it. Is it, a set of 5 SKUs initially? Can we bring in our full portfolio, which is also how we buffer against some of the pricing, because we know that we have sort of a good, better, best strategy when it comes to our SKU mix. So can we bring all of those in? Only a subset of those? Those are all the inputs that we're really looking at on a regular basis.
Yeah, follow up on that. I mean, you have obviously a proven model in Colorado. You have a number of SKUs. You've churned through some, you've refined, and you found the ones that are most successful. How easy does that make it to transport that model of success in Colorado into a new market? Just say, hey, I'm just going to replicate what I did here in Colorado. It's easy peasy.
Oh, Eric, you just used a word that we never use in cannabis, which is easy. There's nothing easy, right? That doesn't happen. Easy is not how I would describe it, because, okay, let's say, our sleep SKU, one of our top selling SKUs, we have 2 of them actually, a stay asleep and our fast asleep. But in some markets, we have a milligram of melatonin. Other markets, melatonin is not allowed. In some markets, we're allowed minor cannabinoids, and in other markets, we're not. So how we formulate the product then dictates whether or not we can even bring that SKU to a given market. The maturity of the market, right? So we have our Spectrum, which is our live rosin solventless line here in Colorado. We've just begun bringing that into the other markets, but the value proposition there is a consumer that understands what live rosin is and the value of terpenes and whole plant extract and all that good stuff, right? So if that consumer in that market isn't understanding why that product might cost more than another product, we're going to have a challenge selling that in, right? So all of those things figure into whether or not we can take our most successful SKUs from one market and transfer them into another market.
That's interesting, because also all those live rosin, the resin, those are typically outdoor, fresh frozen type extraction methods that, kind of maintain the terpene profile and all the flavors, but and provide a different effect. But some markets don't really have large outdoor grow markets. I mean,
right, access to that material, right? Because it's a very specialized extraction that's not always readily available in every market. So we have to consider that as well. Or if it is available, what is the price point? Because it's a premium product, and we still have to be grounded in some sense of reality, because someone's not going to walk out the door with a $60 pack of 10 gummies, right? So
right. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about partner selection, which is really so critical. And maybe I'll ask just general, high level, like, you're in 15 states. How often have you changed partner?
It's painful to do. We have changed partners a few times. In fact, we've just gotten on the other side of a couple of recent changes. Florida, Maryland, and Arizona all changed partners in the last 2 years. And it is really, really challenging to do, because you've got to completely wind down one relationship. You got to then ramp up another relationship. It's hard to do. So we try to be as intentional and diligent as we can be when choosing partners. But in some cases, there are things that you don't always foresee, right? In this case, when we had our interaction with Canopy, some of our partners, that just didn't sit right with them, right? That's just not something that we necessarily foresaw when we entered into those partnerships. In other cases, they're not able to keep up from a production standpoint with the SKUs that we want to put into market. We feel like we're being kind of held back from really executing our full vision and our strategy in those markets. But when you enter into those relationships, you believe that they're going to be able to track with you. And most partners, I think, intend to. But at the same time, they might be building their own little kingdom, right, where they have additional brands or their own products, or they, looking at their own expansion. So that's a constant in the cannabis industry, is that everyone is still building, right? So nascent that who you are as a company 5 years from now might look vastly different than who you are today. So again, as best we can, we find partners that align with our values and that we can have good communication with, so that if those challenges come up, we figure out ways to get around them. Sometimes it doesn't always work.
So let's talk just about high level. What are those assets that you look for in a partner? What are the resources that you require in that partner? Because it sounds like, everything's changing constantly in this industry. So somebody that's a co-packer all of a sudden decides to launch a brand and has leveraged Wana's brand to get into markets and now sells a competing gummy. Like, those are scenarios that actually play out. But when you're evaluating before you decide to paper a deal, an agreement, IP licensing agreement, what are those things that you're looking for in a partner that maybe both tangible and intangible?
Well, so some of the things that are tangible, and this might sound obvious to you, but do they have a facility already? Is it built out? Do they have their CO there? Do they have their license there? Can they start manufacturing day one? Are they manufacturing for other brands and partners already? That also kind of figures into their expertise. Do they understand how to manufacture gummies and edibles? Because even though we have our own specific set of SOPs and we have our own formulations, we don't want to just hand those over to somebody who's never done that before, right? We have to make sure that there's a level of knowledge and experience. Capitalization. We know that even though this is a partnership designed to help everyone make dollars, there are still investments that have to be made going into it. So back to the facility piece, like if we say, okay, there's not enough capacity to build out what we think is an appropriate footprint, we need to add more space, we need to add more automation, whatever it might be. Are they capitalized, and can they do that to be able to handle that additional capacity? And then lastly, I would say we look at their existing track record. Now, we have partnered with companies where they're relatively new because maybe the market is brand new, but do they have relationships in the market? How long have they been in the market? Do they understand the market better than we do, right? That's important. We're pretty smart people, but we're not in every market, right? So I want a partner who really knows the market that we're going into, that can provide insight to us and value add to the overall proposition. Those are all considerations.
It seems to me, when diving in a little deeper, because this is the granularity, like, is it appropriate to ask for your partner's balance sheet when you're deciding whether to enter into a deal, to see truly what their financial situation is? Or, because cannabis is like, everyone's raising money, some are successful, what have you, and there's always gotchas. There's things that come up that nobody can control, but when you're sitting there saying, I'd really like to partner with you, can you show me your balance sheet? Like, will you do that?
That's a good question. We have, and in some cases we're partnered with publicly traded companies, so we have access to their information pretty readily. But yeah, I think understanding their financial situation and as much reality as possible is important. You say balance sheet. Unless we have access directly to their system and their platform, you could create a balance sheet that shows how much cash you have on hand or some evidence, right? But that doesn't always tell the full picture anyway. So I go back to square one, which is really the human nature of it, looking each other in the eyes and saying, I believe what this person's telling me, and I believe that they're a good partner, and that they have a track record to prove it, right? That they're not being, because look, this is a small industry, right? You're gonna hear about it if there are people in the market that are waiting to get paid by that company, or that that have been stiffed by a company. Those are all indicators to us that maybe there's a cash flow issue.
Yeah, no, certainly AP is a big problem in this industry right now.
Yeah.
So think about your best relationships and your worst relationships, and tell me what what is it about the good ones? What is it? What are those critical success factors that, that make that relationship special? And, subsequently, what are the ones that you wish or you learned that, maybe I should have been paid more attention to this or that when a relationship doesn't work? What are those KPIs?
To build them as KPIs would be challenging, only because I do go back to the art part of this in terms of partnerships. Well, the ones that work are the ones that are communication oriented, that are responsive. I'll tell you, actually, being responsive is an interesting one, because when you're in the initial negotiation phases, we have had discussions with partners where they go dark for periods of time. We're like, we're in the middle of a discussion here, like, what happened? That's not really a good indicator for us. We're like, okay, well, if that's their behavior in the dance, it can't be, it can't be that much better when we're actually working with them. So that's a real red flag for us. Have we pursued despite that, because we got other things that were, I think that led us to believe that was a good partnership? We have, but it comes back, right? It comes back to haunt you sometimes when the partner is less than responsive or forthcoming when you're in those initial negotiations. But I would say that the partnerships that work best are the ones where there's great communications, the ones where it's a true sharing of knowledge and information. We don't know everything, but we know our product and we know the gummy market pretty well. So we know what happens when X competitor comes into market. We know strategies to help, kind of defend against that. If a partner, we've had partners that are like, that's great, let's do that. Other partners are like, no, we know better. This is, we're fine. And, then unfortunately that comes back to bite you, because that is our area of expertise. Likewise, they may have improvements to the operation that, or things that we hadn't thought about. So partners that are also really buttoned up operationally are usually a much better partner for us. And then lastly, back to communication. Challenges are going to occur no matter what, right? The best partnerships, there's still going to be challenges, because this is the cannabis industry and it's challenging. So are you of like mind that there's a problem solving perspective that you have versus we're right, you're wrong, or this is the way that we're going to do it? If we can have discussion and get through those challenges together, that's going to result in a much better partnership.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you in a second about partnering with the MSOs. But before I get there, do you have a preference? Have you learned anything about partnering with a company that is a pure co-packer that just makes third-party products, or partnering with a brand, maybe obviously not another gummy brand, but a brand that has extraction and has excess capacity and lots of biomass, but they're a brand, they've got sales and marketing, they have feet on the street? Have you developed a preference in who you partner with and how those relationships, based on how those relationships play out?
Well, you just kind of outlined the double-edged sword there, right? Because I wouldn't say we've developed a preference, because if you look at our partners across the country, we have both. We have both types of partners. And we do know that having some control over our sales and marketing in every market is pretty essential. So even in those markets where our partner is the sales or marketing partner, we will have feet on the street, someone in the market on the sales side, usually someone in the market on the marketing side, to either provide support or at the very least ensure that we have our arms around what's going on in that market. So that's a given. We do that regardless. In terms of the benefit, I mean, having a built-in sales team that has the relationships, that goes into those stores regularly, that can easily get your product on the shelf, that's a benefit. Are they going to do it in exactly the right way, or do we end up getting partnered or lumped in with their other products that they're selling, so that potentially if dispensary X doesn't want all of their SKUs, they're going to say, well, that's the minimum the order, so do we get wrapped up in that sometimes? Yeah, and that's unfortunate, but that's why it's this this double-edged sword. But that's also where having our own team in the market can help problem solve for some of that, and say, okay, hey, we're seeing this minimum order quantity is being an issue, or delivery times is being an issue, based on conversations we're having with dispensaries in the market. How can we problem solve for that and get around that? That's part and parcel of having, whether it's a large MSO as your partner, or a smaller company that's building their brand in the market. That's always going to be part of the challenges, helping them dial in what's ultimately best for us, but also balancing against what they have, their needs are in the market in terms of the portfolio or the company they're trying to build out.
Talk to me about the MSOs kind of have a bad rap as being partners that, are, they're just not the best partners, okay? And some people will say they're stealing my IP, I'm teaching them everything, and then they throw me out and what have you. But others say, and I think it's less so in the edible space, it's certainly in the vape category. But from your experience and your discussions with MSOs, you've partnered with a few, you've probably chosen not to partner with a few. What is it about, what's different about partnering with MSOs than partnering with a small regional state brand or a regional co-packer?
Sure, and I think, one of the first things that comes to mind for me is just their focus, right? We know that MSOs are constantly building and constantly building out, whether it's new markets, new SKUs, their own brands, whatever it might be. And we are part of that. And we get the advantage of, them being larger, maybe in a market and having their own retail channel that we can sell through and all that good stuff. But, the flip side is we have to advocate much more loudly for us and for our brand and to make sure that things are moving forward correctly. But, I think the upside of working with an MSO is, again, this footprint that they often have that's built in place. In some cases, we're able to leverage that into markets where they are not our partner. So we have maybe a retail relationship in other markets outside of the producing market where they are. And we've partnered. We've got. I'm probably going to misstate this, but 2 or 3 partners currently that would qualify as true MSOs. And they are by and large more sophisticated, but they also tend to be a little bit more distracted in terms of everything they have going on.
So where they're not ghosting you like some of the other folks, but they are unattentive because they're just so swamped with work. So
yeah, and it does. The other piece that's probably unspoken is there's a little bit of like, well, are they suppressing our sales because they're trying to sell their own products, or just making sure that we're all clear and above board on that is important, and kind of maybe helps to remove some of the concerns about that. If we can have a dialogue, if we understand their pricing strategy and where we fit into that, that's super helpful. But by and large, if we do partner with an MSO, our contracts and our SOPs and everything else are pretty, they're pretty tight, right? So I would say we have less concern with, are they stealing my IP and producing the same product, and more concern with what else are they doing that's not letting them focus on us the way that we want to.
Yeah, makes sense. So I want to start to move the discussion towards about, deal structure and commitments. But before we go there, talk to me about the actual expansion team. Is it hub and spoke? Like, how do you actually manage state by state expansion? What does your team look like, and how has that progressed? Is it all internal, housed in Colorado and doing the analytics and then going to fly to meet new partners? Or are you to a point where you have regional centers of excellence or what have you? What is that expansion?
So it's kind of right in the middle of what you're describing. Now, we don't have regional centers of excellence, which I think would be great if we did, but we don't. But what we do have is first of all, we have a disparate team anyway, right? Because that's just the nature of both the industry, but as well as business in general right now. We're no longer saying we have to be located here, here, here. So we have people in different parts of the country that are intimately involved with our market expansion. So we have a market expansion team, a dedicated team that focuses on the operational side of that. And then, for my team on marketing, we also have a market expansion team that focuses just on supporting our partners, making sure they have all the point of sale and the materials that they need, and they get all the proper brand positioning and help facilitate the packaging and all that good stuff. So we do have folks that are dedicated. They're not necessarily specific to each market, because then they work directly with as I mentioned earlier, the sales or the marketing folks in those markets to help facilitate sort of a 360-degree approach to those partnerships, without necessarily having these, regional centers of excellence. But we also have a QA team. So they're charged with ensuring that, okay, the market expansion team on the operations side or the marketing side has gotten this partner up and running. They have the SOPs, we test all the product, we know everything's good, we launch. How's it going a month in? How's it going 2 months in, 3 months in? Are they Are the gummies the right consistency? The lab tests coming back with the proper dosing, all that good stuff. Do we need to dial in anything else? As well as how do we plan for, oh, we want to launch our quick products, which means training on the Azuka platform and also creating contract directly with Azuka so they can get access to the products. All of that kind of comes into play, but it's a little bit centralized from the standpoint that really comes from our market expansion team.
So is the first step in that process of you determining what kind of resources you will dedicate and then subsequently what kind of deal you need to structure, is that really an analysis of the sales, like feet on the street requirement in a certain, before we talk about marketing, is it really analyzing that partner and understanding what their capabilities are in terms of sales and then realizing pretty quickly based on your experience how you have to augment or support, or at least maybe your own feet on the street? Maybe you, at this point, are you hiring your own salespeople in every market? Like, how do you look at the sales part before we get to the marketing?
I much of this gets structured in the upfront negotiation of the contract, right? And yes, it is grounded in what is their bandwidth, what are their capabilities, do they have a really strong sales team already in place that we can just tap into or not, but that usually is structured up front as part of the understanding, who gets what share of the revenue based on what kind of resources you put in. Now, that said, if we have a market where maybe we are opting to leverage their sales team, as I mentioned earlier, we're still hiring, we're still adding folks to the field to help support and augment that. So, but that's more of a making sure that we're representing the brand the way that we want to be represented in that market, not from the standpoint of like checking in on the partner, but also just helping to facilitate communications in more of a Wana forward way within a given market. So we do a little bit of analysis up front. We make the determination based on the contractual agreement, and then we decide at what point does it make sense to augment, add staff to a given market. So that's kind of an ongoing analysis, because I don't necessarily say that day one we add additional headcount. So Mississippi would be a good example. We're not currently right now today hiring to add someone to Mississippi because it's still a relatively small market, right? But as it grows, that's when we look at saying, do we want to add someone to that market?
It's interesting because it's, you obviously oversee this. So is it sales or is it marketing? A lot of times it's budtender education and getting those displays looking good and explaining the value. But it's always tricky to be like, are you giving that guy a quota, or is he on the marketing side? Is he on the sales side with a quota? And it's an interesting balance of how do you kind of ramp up a market, and at what point do you bring in someone to say, okay, we're giving you a head start, we're doing X thousands in units in this market, and we're going to give you the sales quota of, that's your base, and go from there. But salespeople walk into stores, and part of their job is to educate those folks on the brand.
Absolutely.
It's an interesting balance. How do you play it? How do you think about it?
Well, we think about it really. Our sales and marketing organizations here are pretty tight. So Erik Ott, who's our CRO, he and I work together on a pretty regular basis, and we look at it on a market by market basis, and we say, okay, what does this market need? And if it's, well, really we only need one headcount. All right, well, maybe we start with a sales brand manager, and that person is responsible for some of the marketing duties. In some cases, it's vice versa, because generally, particularly in a market where we're not necessarily handling sales directly, we're considering the sales brand manager to be a conduit more so than saying you specifically have an X, Y, and Z sales quota in that market. We're looking at sort of lifting the overall market versus a store by store revenue target, and we help with the strategy on the sales side with the existing partners in those markets.
Yeah. Interesting. So let's dive into a little bit here of a discussion on, let's just start with the basics. What is negotiated in these IP licensing agreements? What are the top 3 critical items that you negotiate with your prospective partner?
Well, the most critical one is revenue share, right? What does that look like? And that's an important piece of that. Kind of tied to it, I mean, it really all kind of flows from there, because then it's who handles sales, who handles marketing, and what does that look like? And then lastly, it's commitment to a roadmap. making sure that we feel comfortable and the partner feels comfortable that, hey, this is how we like to launch our products. Are you on board with that? Are you capable of supporting that? Because we feel like that's the best model. So it's not, it's not too onerous. I mean, of course, anytime you get a bunch of lawyers in a room together, they're gonna squabble over red lines and words and all that good stuff. But really, it's really the revenue share, it's the sales and marketing piece, and it's the roadmap.
Yeah. So on the sales and marketing, I mean, have you entered markets at this point where you literally have a co-packer and they're like, I can make a great product, your product's great, I follow your SOPs, but from the time that thing's in a box, it's yours. You take it and you run with it.
Sure.
Have you? Yeah. And on the one hand, I mean, I have to imagine that you've got to be taking the lion's share of the revenue share in that for situation, because you have all the costs, all the commitment, and all the risk. Not all the risk, but most of the risk, and it's brand risk. I mean, can you get deals where you're like north of 50% of the economics of a deal because you've got a lot of COGS and OpEx in the background?
Well, we don't tend to discuss percentages, so I can
Fair enough.
sidestep the answer directly to that. But I will say that, yeah, that percentage is all tied exactly to what you just said, which is who's taking the risk, who's putting in the resources, what does that cost look like? But we also know that if it's all our people on the ground and doing the sales and doing the marketing, we also know we have probably a greater potential to control our outcome and our destiny.
What would be the converse of that, the lightest touch model? What market that if you come in where it was really turnkey, great partner, and you actually don't have to do that much? Is that, obviously we're dealing with lower end of the royalty scheme here, but has that been something that has occurred for you?
Yeah, we have a couple partnerships like that, exactly. And yes, to your point, lower rev share as a result. But what we still do, and I said this earlier, and I'll repeat myself here, but we still invest in the market. So even with the best partnership where we maybe have a lower rev share but everything's running smoothly, we still want our people on the ground. We still want people in that market to help build that presence in the market.
Is there a direct correlation? And you look at the two models, the super IP light, right, and the more aggressive, like, okay, I got a lot of headcount in here, I'm actually helping run production or what have you, just the more significant commitment. Is there a correlation to how revenues scale in those markets based on different tactics or approaches you take, or could they be equally as economically beneficial?
Good question. And I think I would answer that by saying, and I mentioned this a couple seconds ago, we have greater control over our destiny when we're doing more of it in a given market. But to your point, we have to look at the cost of that, and some of those costs are not easy to identify, right? From the standpoint of headcount, turnover, all these things that can factor into the cost of being in a market, that maybe our overall margins are slightly lower, but our volumes are higher, or all of those things kind of really figure into that modeling overall. So I wouldn't say that there's a definitive answer to say this is the model that works best. And frankly, if we knew that, if we said this is the model that works best, that's probably the model we pursue in every market. But there's so many other factors involved. Everything from, does that co-manufacturer who wants to give up the lion's share of the revenue, does that exist in a market, to what are the regulations in that market to allow for it?
Yeah, I think scale means different things to different people, and obviously you do the ROI calculations on the investment you've made. How often are you going back and checking that original business plan that you laid out with that partner? Like, are you looking at it at 6 months? Are you looking at it 12 months? Or maybe a better question, is there a business plan that you guys agree on that this is what we are going to try to do? Yeah, it's pro forma, it's all forward thinking, right? We know what we have to do to get it up and running. But is there a business plan that you create in each market with the partner and you guys agree on what we're going to do, and then you're always checking where you are relative to those quarterly increments or what have you?
Yeah, it's the latter, and it's not even at a specific cadence. as much as it is, because it can be, particularly in a newer market, it can vary significantly by month, right? And there's so many things that factor into it, like, oh, all of a sudden there's a raw plant material shortage and we can't access distillate, or the cost of distillate has gone up, or 5 new competitors launched in the last 3 weeks, or all those things kind of really factor into it. So we look at the numbers on a weekly basis. Would we course correct based on weekly data? No, but we're definitely, we definitely outline, this is the pro forma, this is where we think revenue should be based on your output, our modeling, and we're checking in on that monthly and quarterly to say, okay, are we hitting those goals and targets? Not as a way to say, it's never a contractual part of the agreement that says you have to be at this revenue or these number of units, because we know that's not realistic. But we do have language that makes sure that we're all on the same page about exactly, how much backstock should you have, what does inventory management look like, because we want to make sure that at the very least we have enough product to sell, right? Because that's kind of the important part in selling a product, is to actually have it to sell. But we're tracking against those numbers on a, again, weekly, monthly, and quarterly basis. If we see quarter sustained issues, that's when we would say, okay, what's going on? Why is this not working? We should have good insight prior to making that, having that discussion, because we've been talking about it. But that's the point at which we say, what needs to change here? How do we need to? Is it the pricing? Is it the market itself? Is it consumer pull through? What are the issues that we think are occurring?
Yeah, I mean, critical stuff that ultimately, like, there's a lot of gross margin focus, but the truth is, it really starts with like your inventory base, right? Well, how much do you have to invest in inventory? Because that's where you're tying up most of your money on an initial foray into a new market. And if you miscalc on one way or another, you miscalc that, you think there's going to be a lot of demand, there isn't, or vice versa, that's like, it's a constant cash flow scramble, right?
Yeah.
Have you achieved scale that way in markets where you just feel like this market is just operating like it's so darn consistent? I got it. It's under control. Obviously, you want to grow in every market. That's the goal. But have you gotten to a point where you've achieved scale in one single market?
Yeah. There's been a couple of those. But again, this is cannabis. We don't take our eye off the ball. I mean, we just can't, right? So yeah, okay. Everything's going smooth there. We have those partners where internally we'll say like, oh, they're fine. We don't need to worry about them. But in reality, we're still checking, right? We're still making sure we're watching the market dynamics. We're all constantly on top of the regulatory changes. We're constantly on top of the market dynamics. So yeah, in a handful, we've been able to do that. Also in a handful, we've gone through a full cycle where it's gone down and then back up and then stabilized, and we're feeling more confident about a market. But never do we say it's done and everything is going smooth, because we know that's not reality. So we can't.
Yeah. We're going to continue to talk about some relationship management, but we actually have a question, and I'll invite anybody else that wants to throw a question in to please do so in the box. But we have a question here saying, how do you gain sticky insights on the trust of a potential partners? What goes into understanding how you get that trust factor? How do you build? You can't. It's not data that you can analyze, I suppose. How do you kind of build that? Is that all about, well, you tell me.
Yeah, it's not about data in some cases, right? It's about, and it was interesting because we did sign some relationship contracts during COVID where we weren't visiting, we weren't sitting across the table from somebody, and we still had success, right? But it's about taking your time, right? So there's always this. I like to talk about the fact that in the cannabis industry, you've got two concentric circles going. One is on the inside going super, super fast, and then you got one on the outside that's going really, really slow. And so when you get trapped in that inner one, and you're like, we got to go, we got to be in this market tomorrow, you might jump into decisions with a partner that maybe you haven't fully vetted, maybe you haven't had. Some cases we'll have 10 conversations with a partner just to ask more questions, get to know them better. We have a few filters that are important to us, like what's their stance on community involvement? Are they involved with the community? What do their employees think about them? How do they feel about DEI initiatives? All those things that are important to us culturally. If we find a fit there, that's a good sort of first step, but we still conversation, conversation, conversation. And eventually, if there's a problem somewhere, it's going to come out right in that process. So it's important to make sure that you're not pulling the trigger, or you're not just focusing on what's in the contract, but you're talking about the human relationship in it, because it's a marriage, right? And you got to make sure you're with the right partner.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that, CPG, right? You are a CPG brand. The core fundamental part of that is the consistency. The same product, Big Mac, Bud Light, pick your large, CPG companies. You're similar, yet in each market, and granted, like gummies are not incredibly complicated, but they're nuanced, right? I mean, you've got the whole pectin, gelatin, you've got all these different, you've got the quality of the input, the distillate going in, you have live resin. What happens when a partner struggles with the supply chain, or, even worse, maybe making your product to the proper spec? Do you have to kind of fly in the team and reboot the SOP process, or how do you make sure you don't create brand damage to Wana for what is, everyone thinks is a great product, but in certain market something happened and now your risk is dramatically increased?
Yeah, well, so part of that answer goes back to what we talked about earlier in terms of SOPs, and really having strong, solid SOPs, which in many cases also includes supply chain, right? So we try to ensure that the supply chain is the exact same as, or within the same spec as we would use. Because your point about the complications of gummies doesn't feel like a complicated product, but if you change the type of tapioca syrup you use, if the humidity is different in a different area or facility, all of those things really affect the outcome of the product. So it is a delicate dance. And so, excuse me, so we try to make sure that we have as much of that, locked down with the partner as we can, so it doesn't allow for a lot of variability. I will also say that we've, been pretty, I want to say lucky, but it's of course with intention, that we haven't really run into that issue, partly because we are in such constant discussions with our partners. We're going out to visit on a regular basis. We're ensuring that they're kind of mapping to the SOPs that we've outlined. We really haven't had a case where someone's like, well, we don't have enough of X, so we're just going to put this in here. We're not going to tell Wana. That really hasn't occurred. And of course, that would be a violation of our contract as well. So.
Right. So what you're saying is that there may be hiccups in the supply chain, but it would be, the collective partnerships, mistake if they didn't anticipate that coming down the road. Now, yeah, I don't know if you're willing to share this, but I mean, how many? Colorado is your home market at this point. How many? And you don't have to share if you don't want, but how many SKUs do you have in Colorado?
Well, they don't want to share. Just haven't added them up in a while. I'm going to say between med and rec, flavor profiles, product types, we're probably upwards of, in Colorado, probably 40 plus. And then if you look nationwide, we're probably in 90. And if anyone from the Wana team is listening, they're like, oh, that's completely wrong, Jeff. I think it's somewhere in that category.
So I think coming back to something we touched on before. So if you have 40 SKUs in Colorado, where you've done a ton of, I mean, I don't want to say you've achieved scale, but you've come pretty darn close to achieving scale in Colorado. You're still looking for growth, I'm sure, but you've achieved scale. You have 40 SKUs, yet in other markets, you can go into these other markets and be like, look at all these products that do great. And like you said, it's like, well, we don't have, an outdoor market, or we don't have, so scale actually has to be, you have to, if I hear you correctly, you've got to develop a plan to scale in that market, not every market, that market. With New Jersey, you need a scale plan. For Illinois, you need a scale plan, and that is going to impact how many SKUs and the sequence of which you roll those out. Is that the way you kind of think about scaling into new markets with, like, okay, how do we launch? Do we launch with 3 SKUs and just get it? Like, do we need to launch with a certain amount of SKUs to have the breadth, or the price points, gold, silver, bronze? What goes into all that?
I was just gonna say you got it exactly right, and I don't have anything to add to it except you asked a question at the end there. So yeah, when we go into a market, brand new market, and it's not a hard and fast number, but we generally like to have some number of SKUs that, that gives at least a breadth of on the shelf as well as consumer preference and choice. So, a ratio product, a couple of our classic SKUs, that kind of thing. Ideally, we've also got our quick SKUs, but often because that's a little bit more complicated with the addition of Bazooka, as well as the additional capacity needed to be able to produce that number of SKUs, we maybe will roll those in second. But it also a little bit depends on the market, right? So how many other products are out there in the market? How much shelf space do we think we can gain with our additional SKUs? We want to be able to demonstrate a depth and breadth of our products. And I'll just tell you a quick anecdote. So when I first started with Wana, there was such an obsession with my marketing team about making sure that, boy, if we're going to talk about a product, got to make sure that product's in this market or that market. I don't want people in Illinois seeing our quick SKUs if they can't have access to them. I said, I want them to see it, right? I want them to know the world of Wana and what's potential and what we can do, because I think it adds value to the brand, also creates demand in a given market before a product gets there. So we've kind of shifted the thinking about that. I want people, in a market where we don't have quick, I want them coming in the dispensary. Do you have that Wana quick yet? Because that's going to obviously, spur a partner to want to take that on. And, in some cases they do have to add manpower, facility power, automation, whatever, to be able to add additional SKUs to the mix they've already got.
Nice. All right, we got some good questions coming in from the attendees. How do you gather and control consumer data collectively in each state?
How do I gather and control it? I neither gather nor control it, unfortunately. I mean, there's of course, there are a couple platforms, Headset, BDSA, those guys, that have look backs on sales data, right? So there's that piece. But when it comes down to real, true consumer data, there's a dearth of it, right? So we have two options. We either do custom studies with third-party partners, or we have a little bit of data as it relates to iHeartJane, which is a platform that we have on our back end, so we can leverage some of that a little bit. But we don't really have a great sense for specific consumer data, because we don't have access to the point of sale, and dispensaries are fairly loath to share that data. So it's really a struggle to try and get access to that and to be able to analyze it, other than looking at it posthumously and saying, all right, we launched this product, it's not selling as well. Let's dig into why. And is it a consumer preference issue? Is it a distribution issue? What are the problems that are preventing that from meeting the expectations that we have for it?
Have you therefore developed, though, what you believe to be your target demographic, just either through all that kind of what I'll call down and dirty analytics that may not be completely data driven because of this lack of information, but do you have some clarity on who the demographic is, and then do you test those assumptions in a new market to make sure it is the, I don't know, the 70-year-old sleep deprived grandmother, or the 22-year-old, sorority? I don't know. Where do you land on that continuum of defining customer data?
Yeah, and we look at demographics, but we know we skew slightly more female. Some of that data, and we know household income is a little bit higher than average. And again, we have some of that from both companies like Brightfield, as well as custom studies we've done, as well as some of the iHeartJane data. But and here's the big difference. As a marketer, I don't feel like the industry is mature enough yet for me to really begin to subdivide and categorize, right? I mean, and in some industries, this would be a no-no to say, but I want to be pretty available and appealing to a broader audience, because that's really the cannabis consumer currently. I'm not segmenting by specific demographics to say, like, this is who our target is, I'm going to go right after that. There are some brands that do, but I think you kind of limit yourself. Instead, what we do is we look at a lot of use case specificity. So if you look at our recent rollout of products, we're coming out with products that are designed specifically for, let's say it's sleep. Let's say it's our quick calm product for anxious feelings and anxiety. It's our Spectrum line. All of these things are really targeted based on specific use cases that the consumer broadly, right, not a specific consumer, but the consumer would have an affinity for. And we're seeing that, just in the numbers looking at the sales, like those sleep SKUs, they crush, right? Because we know that sleep is a major issue. And I'm not dividing it by saying it's a sleep issue for someone who's older or a sleep issue for someone who's female. I'm just saying it's a sleep issue.
So we have a great question. The setup to this question is, I think we all know people that have had a really bad experience with edibles.
Yeah.
You take a little bit too much and it definitely hits you different than smoking too much, right? I mean, I'm one of many that can speak from experience. Even still to this day, I know I titrate, I know what I like, I know what I take, but every once in a while I go over the edge and I'm like, I really wish I didn't do that. That would suggest that there is real merit in the fast acting edible category. So the question that was just thrown here was, how is the demand for the Wana quick versus original, and how quickly is that growing? Do consumers prefer quick over original after they try it, the fast acting over the slow acting, I guess, if you will? Yeah, it may not be best practices for brand expansion, but I think it's a fascinating question that your attendees would love to hear.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, when we first launched Quick, one of our considerations was, are we going to cannibalize our classic line, right? And what we began to realize is that, and we, marketed towards this, of course, is that there's really two different experiences. Your Quick experience is going to be a Delta 9, faster acting, but shorter acting experience overall, which might be right for certain situations. And then our classic product, which is an 11-hydroxy experience, completely different, like the traditional body high, edible type high. So we realized that there were two different experiences and we can market it that way. So that's point number one. In terms of overall sales, we have seen the Quick lines, and collectively, like I'm not talking about individual SKUs because our assorted flavor classics is still one of our top sellers, but collectively the Quick SKUs have outpaced the classics in most markets, but not all markets. And the reason being is that sometimes it depends upon how we launch them, because we did it in reverse in Nevada. We launched Quick initially, and then we launched our classic. The classic line is it's one where it's sort of the introduction to Wana, and then the Quick is like, okay, so now I've taken this and I want to see what a fast acting is. The other way we found like didn't really work as well, right? So that's a good learning for us. But in most markets, they're neck and neck, and it also depends upon when we've launched, how long it's been in the market. It also depends upon the competitors in that market, because there's so much noise around nano encapsulation and fast acting, and we weren't the first to bring out a fast acting product, but I'm willing to say pretty strongly we're the best fast acting product. And we did that because we took the time to really understand what are the technologies, what works best, and how to create a true fast acting product with a differentiated experience. So, in some markets, there's been so much noise that I think we have to convert people, right? So we have to convince them to try it, and then they understand, okay, this actually is fast acting, it really works. So it's a little bit slower of a burn depending upon what's in that market.
We have hit the hour, the bewitching hour. Joe, it has been a pleasure to have you on. So much knowledge, so much learning that you've shared with the attendees. And so we really appreciate you for joining and sharing that knowledge. Tremendous webinar, and we are back in about a month with another webinar. You'll be learning more, hearing more about that soon. But again, Joe Hodas, Chief Marketing Officer of Wana Brands, all the best to you. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you everyone for attending. We will look forward to continuing this dialogue in the future. All the best, Joe. Thank you. Cheers.